Did Germany ever seem close to winning World War II? If so, what prevented them from succeeding? There were times they seemed close to victory, but they never actually were. They had no way to actually take Britain out of the fight, no way to avoid attacking the USSR, and no way to actually win given those circumstances. It's a great illustration of how fucking stupid fascism is. The Nazis worked their way into a corner where they had no choice but to start an unwinnable war which they had to pretend they could not lose. Lot of strange comments here. Things like how they messed up by exterminating the Jews or messed up by invading Russia. Invading Russia and defeating communism was the entire point of WW2. The extermination of the Jews was one of the main reasons for the war in the first place. If you take both of those away, then there is no objective to the war. Do people think Hitler just wanted to occupy France for a vacation spot and then call a truce? He and a lot of people around him wanted to rid the world of Bolshevism, protect the land taken from Germany over the years, and preserve a bloodline and heritage to last for 1,000 years. The only real chance they would have at forcing the Soviet Union to capitulate would have been at the Battle of Moscow. The plan was to kick off the invasion and have the local populace overthrow Stalin and his government in a few months. Had that happened, they could have probably sued for peace and carried out a lot of their plan. The second the USSR and US joined the war, it was lost for Germany. The industrial output of the US alone was too much for Japan or Germany to keep up with, especially with the US being an untouched island while the Axis industrial might was being bombed to ashes. The USSR just had endless corpses to throw at Germany. If Germany ended their conquest early, like taking Poland, then maybe they could have won, but the Nazis wanted the entire continent. Probably after the capitulation of France, when Britain stood alone, but they declared war on the USA and invaded the SU. The key make or break moment was probably the months after the fall of France in 1940, and the months on from there, during which Germany planned and then abandoned plans for an invasion of the UK. There were strong forces in the British government wanting the UK to sign a peace treaty with Germany in order to avoid a full invasion. But luckily those who believed it best to carry on held the argument, and once they'd successfully fought off the Battle of Britain, they were proven right. If the UK had accepted a peace at that point, the whole of Europe, including the UK, would have been a mere puppet of Germany, and the US would likely have never entered the European war. Lives would have been saved on paper initially, but longer term the Holocaust would have been even worse, and an alternative Cold War with the US would probably have developed. There's loads of alternative history books and films out there which speculate on what would have happened in the decades after. If they didn't get too cocky in Britain and Russia and didn't join Japan in their war in America, they probably could have kept control over Europe. Before they directly involved the Americans, maybe. It would have required restraint and ideological tempering. German intel made it clear that if the Americans decided to intervene, their basically untouchable industrial capacity would eventually overwhelm Germany. The Japanese came to the same conclusion, and yet, due to ideology and balance of power, both decided to roll the dice and try to kick the Americans at the knees before they could rev up their industrial engine, which they thought would take quite a few years. As it turned out, the Americans blew out all predictions of industrial output by wide margins. By late 1942, it was evident the Americans had already efficiently retooled their factories for a total war footing. By mid-1943, there was no chance of an Axis victory. The US was building more planes, trucks, tanks, and ships than the rest of the world combined, and it wasn't even remotely close. By the end of the war in 1945, the US had 40 aircraft carriers, entire fleets of advanced long-range bombers, a sophisticated supply chain network on 3 continents, and nuclear weapons. All of that was accomplished in only 3.5 years. There is a brief moment just before the evacuation of Dunkirk, where there was a faction within the British government that was advocating for making a separate peace with the Germans. Had things gone a little differently at the moment, and Hitler had been willing to negotiate, then there was a possibility of them maybe consolidating their conquests. Of course, if they had still invaded the USSR or done something to restart the war with Britain, then all bets are off again. Germany was a relatively small country, and in a vulnerable area, which was able to be attacked from both the east and west after their defenses were dealt with. But it did take the combined effort of the United States allies to hit them hard on the western side, and then the massive army of Russia was just unstoppable on the east side. Plus, bombing the factories 247 non-stop is what really did them in. If you can't replenish your military with new gear after it's been blown up, you won't last too long. The United States had it best being protected by 2 oceans and would take Herculean efforts for either Japan or Germany to really attack mainland US and do any meaningful damage. which meant the US could keep pumping out equipment non-stop. Now if the Germans got the atomic bomb first, that could have changed things. If they bombed London with it, and then also tried to bomb New York, that would be a game changer. I spoke to some people who lived through it. In the UK it got very scary. They were bombed. The government had detailed plans for a Nazi invasion. It was just a horrific time of uncertainty, at least until the US entered. Another lady grew up in the Netherlands. To her the Nazis did win. They killed people in her village, they marched past her house, they controlled everything. There was no certainty it would ever end. That was the horror. Think back to the start of lockdown. Scary as shit. They thought they could beat a Russian winter. There are several nails in the coffin, but the largest two would probably be Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the USSR, which turned WW2 into a multi-front war for Germany, and Pearl Harbor, or more specifically, Germany declaring war on the US just after Pearl Harbor. This caused both of the nations who would go on to become the two biggest world powers post-WW2 to go to war with the Third Reich at the same time. The Enigma communication machine was encrypted by Alan Turing in World War II, and that significantly changed the trajectory of World War II. Trying to invade the Soviets. Same mistake made time and time again, marched on Moscow. The single main mistake was the declaration of war against Russia. Irk, the book Inferno, by Max Hastings said that if the Nazis had stopped a British supply line into the Mediterranean for oil and other supplies, that would have brought the British that much closer to defeat. Everyone is saying the invasion of the Soviet Union was the turning point, but I'd argue if Operation Barbarossa had have kicked off a few months early, they could have captured Moscow before the winter and reinforced a border the other side of Moscow that would have kept the Soviets at bay. That being said, Hitler wanted world domination and would never have been satisfied without complete destruction of Britain and all of the Soviet Union, which would never have worked and would always have resulted in failure. Hitler was the Nazis' downfall. He was a bad general. A really bad one. With a better commander they might have beaten the Russians and things would have been very different. Not really. Here's the thing about fascist authoritarians. They think they are the superior race. Nazi Germany is just an example of how ideology, victory disease, and arrogance was its downfall. Nazi Germany would have never be at peace with the USSR, because Hitler said that himself Germany needed land from the USSR and viewed anyone that wasn't Aryan as inferior. Also consider how Nazi Germany conducted its war. They believed in short and quick victories by taking a nation's capital and then recovering. Obviously they did that with Russia and it failed horribly for them because once the logistics, notably oil, were targeted, it was over. That and Japan bringing the US into the war, they were fighting a losing war. As they say, you can't win a war on two fronts. The problem is that the fascist ideology that directly motivated German conquests, ethnic cleansing, and genocide to start WW2 in Europe is the very ideology that prevented them from calling it quits when they were ahead, suing for peace with the UK and Russia, and accepting their gains as good enough. They never had enough oil, so no. Nearly all answers here forgot the most important part of a war: money and resources. Germany had built up their army on a shady bad loan system which only didn't collapse because of the war. Germany had not enough fat to feed their people, not enough oil and rubber to keep a war machine going. On top of that, the ideology of the Nazis was about getting land Lebensraum in the east and extermination of the local Slavs. So the war with the USSR was a must. The answer is, the closest point to winning WW2 was somewhere before 1930 with Gustav Stresemann in office. If he had the chance to improve the relations to France, Germany could possibly be on the winning side of a war against the USSR at some later point in history. They could never have won the war on their terms at the speed they sought. If they would have ended the war in 1941, before turning on their allies, they probably could have kept a lot of their territory, but they would have had Irish-style terrorists inside their new territories that would be a massive thorn on their side. Multi-ethnic empires are incoherent, and mass genocide and repopulation is unsustainable, so sooner or later they would have collapsed. However, stopping before invading the Soviet Union would have closed the book on the war, which would likely not have been known as a Second World War, but rather a smaller full-scale war.